Good morning, Phil. Thank you so much for taking the time to join my internal communication spotlight series. I speak to thought leaders from around the world on various aspects of communications and specifically internal communications. And very delighted to have you speak about communication preparedness. I know you have a lot of varied experience in this area. So before we get started, could you please introduce yourself for our viewers?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity, first of all. So Philippe Borremans. I'm from Belgium originally. Left the country some years ago, lived in Morocco, and now live in Portugal. Professionally, I am what is called an emergency risk communication consultant. So, like many of my colleagues, or if not all of my colleagues, been fighting this this COVID-19 for the last more than 400 days. And what it actually means is that I work as an independent consultant for organizations like WHO, other UN agencies, EU agencies, and mainly up till now, mainly Africa, West African countries, Asia, and the Caribbean. And so on a practical level, what does that mean? Whenever we have an outbreak somewhere, we send in with a team and we look at how communications at the end of the day can save lives. That's what we do.
Fantastic. And it's a very unique area, I would say, and much needed. So again, just wanted to understand you got background in emergency, risk, and crisis comm. So how do you define communication preparedness?
Well, it's a very large topic, but I think we don't discuss that enough. We talk a lot about crisis communications, about risk communication, but it's a bit, if you look at it from a private sector, I've worked in the private sector for many years, for multinationals like IBM, where I was responsible for the public relations, for instance. Preparedness from a communications point of view as well is exactly the same thing as you would approach health or security or other topics like that. And that is what preparedness is. You prepare in what we call peacetime. And what the ultimate goal is that you would integrate that into a company culture. So crisis preparedness, for instance, from a communications point of view, is something that you do not want a small team to be responsible for. You need a team of specialists and they will do the work. But you want to integrate that into every single level of the company, where employee Y can signal something which is an issue, which could then later become a crisis, so that you've got more time. And that is exactly what preparedness is. Then, of course, if you look at it from another point of view, in the context of epidemics or pandemics, that is national or country level preparedness, but the principle is exactly the same.
Got it. So according to you, how much time should communicators invest in this, and how different is this from communication planning, which anyway happens?
Well, it's more like you would integrate that and again, we're talking about the perfect world, and I know the realities of working in a company, and but in a perfect world, it's integrated into your planning. If today you are responsible for communications in a company, you would have a strategic communications plan, I would suppose, which integrates internal communications. And if everything works fine in that internal communications part of that plan, you would have identified communication channels and procedures for employees to report an issue, for instance, which you then take up before it becomes a crisis and before it goes to the crisis communications team, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's an integrated approach. Of course, that is a perfect world. I know that in many companies, the internal comms plan is separate from the external comms plan, and then people don't talk to each other and what have you. But one thing that I often say to crisis communications or risk communication colleagues is that your very first communication you do in the context of a crisis or an emergency is internal, not the reactive statement for the media. Your first communication is internal. So you better be good friends with your internal communications colleagues, and they should be implicated in the planning. When you do a risk analysis, I'm talking from crisis communications risk analysis, Internal comms should be at the table.
Right.
And I know that's not really the reality in many cases, unfortunately.
And according to you, what are some of those key elements of communication preparedness? I mean, how do you define or articulate some of them?
Well, it's first of all having systems in place which allow you again to identify issues, because issue management is something that you control. You can still solve the problem. Once it becomes a crisis, then the level of control is less, and then you get into a crisis mode, which is a different dynamic. So making sure that you have channels identified, that a feedback loop is in place, that anyone in the company can use these channels to report things, or just to, if you're worried about a certain approach to something, and that could be anything, right? It's a bit like when you work in the chemical sector, for instance, or the very heavy industrial sector. You see these big signs: we didn't have any accidents for so many days. It's exactly the same principle if you don't work in those industries, because those people, anyone there, can report a dangerous setting or a dangerous product which hasn't been set away in a secure way. Well, it's exactly the same for every single industry, even in services companies. So that is one part, that you at least have the channels in place and the procedure. And then it's also ongoing training. We forget that, but it's going from lunch and learn sessions about the general topic of communication preparedness or crisis preparedness, all the way down to doing simulation exercise on a regular basis, reviewing the plans and things like that. But what I often see happening is that it is a responsibility of a crisis communication team, if there is already a crisis communication team. It is a responsibility of the communications department or public relations department.
Right.
But it needs to trickle down. You need to involve all the rest as well, because it's a common understanding of what crises or issues are, so that people can get involved. Because we often forget. I mean, you need your employees, all your employees, once you're in a crisis situation.
Got it. Absolutely. So you, based on your experience in various companies, private and public, and what are some of the signs which tell you that the organization is not prepared from a communication standpoint?
You could see it in some small details, all the way down to what I do from time to time in the private sector, audit, review plans and test them. But already when you come into a company, and I do look at those things, that professional, how easy do you get into that company? What are the security procedures? How well is the signage, the visual welcoming, the visual warning? How easy is it to get meetings with the right people, but then in the correct context? And it's very small things, all the way up to if this organization is in a specific industry which is crisis prone, are the basics in place? Are the basic actions in place? Are the basic, procedures in place? And then when you go up and up and up, and when you really do an audit, you look at history. How have previous issues or crises been handled? Have they learned from those? And then you do a deep dive in the plans, and you see, I immediately want to see, like, okay, so how many times do you do a crisis exercise? Once a year. Okay. Not really, but okay, that's, So it depends on very, very different things, but it goes from very small details, all the way on looking at, okay, what's the plan? How is it structured? Does it take into account different scenarios and things like that?
Got it. And so according to you, what can organizations do to get better with communication preparedness?
I think it's really, and I think a lot of companies will have understood that now. I mean, there are a couple of, from a professional point of view, there are a couple of positives on this pandemic, in the way that I think a lot of communicators have now seen the importance of internal communication. I really see that happening around me. Our internal comms colleagues finally, are on that same level, I hope, but I see that in companies, and that is a good thing. I also think that there will be more interest in not just monitoring. Like companies do monitoring, media monitoring, and social media monitoring, but most of the time it's what I call, a bit of a vanity monitoring. Where does our brand stand? That's nice to know, but that's not why you do monitoring. You want to do predictive analysis. You want to see what's coming. You want to see social movements happening. You want to see what the competition is doing. You want to see what political entities have an impact. So I think that aspect has become more important, or at least some companies and communication professionals start to think about this. And that's where the interest is, because if you do that very well, you see issues and potential crises arise, but you have much more time to prepare, and then prepare yourself and then act whenever they are there. We've often said, a lot of organizations have said, yeah, but who would have a serious epidemic / global pandemic in his risk analysis, and how have we been prepared? I'm sorry to say, but take every single risk report, national or international risk report of the last 5 years, and you will see in the top 5 potential risks, epidemic going over into pandemic.
Right.
Nobody listened. So, it's very well to do monitoring, but if you don't use it to look a bit at the future, potential future, do scenario planning, then you're not really being prepared or doing communication preparedness.
Got it. That's a brilliant insight. And as we wrap up, Philip, I just want to ask you, what is the advice you have for communicators? Because most of the communicators are advising leaders on how to prepare effectively. So what advice do you have for communicators?
I think the biggest lessons learned now should be applied. And for me, there's one that sticks out. It's what we've often forgotten, or we still do, but out of habit, which is stakeholder identification, mapping, and engagement or management, if you want to. I think most communicators do that at the start of the year, or the start of a plan, and they, play with the post-its, and then it's done, and then it's good. But it's an ongoing activity. And what we've now seen, I think, is that if you would have had a good, actively engaged stakeholder plan, things would have gone a bit better in the way that suddenly a company became responsible for the health of their employees. I mean, not from a health insurance point of view, but from also a communications point of view. And you had to inform people about, wearing a mask, and now we're getting, how do you get people back in the office?
Right.
All these things, if organizations really look at stakeholder analysis, mapping, and engagement, then it's much more easier to, if something happens or arrives or comes up, that you can involve your stakeholders from different aspects: government, NGOs, pressure groups, employees, and so that it's much more, you don't have to start from zero, which I think a lot of companies had to do when this happened, because they were not really actively engaging with communities, engaging with stakeholders.
Got it. This is brilliant, Philip. Thank you so much. I mean, I really appreciate you taking the time, and these are wonderful perspectives. And this is a very interesting and important topic, and especially in this pandemic that we are facing. So thank you again for taking the time.
And so thank you for the invitation. It was really fun to do this, and to meet you finally virtually and see you as well. So thank you for the opportunity.